The rain came down in sheets, relentless and cold, soaking through my thin jacket within minutes. I had left work late, lulled into a false sense of security by the overcast sky that promised only drizzle. Now, standing under the flickering light of a street lamp on an unfamiliar road, I cursed myself for not checking the weather app before heading out. My phone was dead. Of course it was. And the bus stop where I'd taken shelter offered little protection from the storm raging around me. Cars splashed past, their tires sending up sprays of water that soaked my shoes and chilled me to the bone, that I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, trying to ward off the shivers racking my body. It wasn't just the cold gnawing at me. It was everything else too, the weight of the day pressing down like lead. Work had been brutal, one endless meeting after another, each punctuated by passive-aggressive comments from colleagues who seemed determined to make my life harder than it already was. And then there was the gnawing loneliness, the kind that crept in when you least expected it, reminding you how empty your apartment would feel once you finally got home. Yes, I stood there, miserable and drenched, headlights pierced through the curtain of rain. A car slowed to a stop beside me, its engine purring softly against the chaos of the storm. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure whether to step back or wave them on. But then the window rolled down, revealing a face half hidden in shadow. "You look like you could use a ride," he said, his voice warm and steady, cutting through the din of the rain that he didn't wait for me to answer. Instead, he leaned across the passenger seat and pushed open the door, gesturing for me to get in. Something about him made me hesitate. Not fear, exactly, but curiosity. There was something magnetic about the way he carried himself, calm and assured despite the storm outside. His eyes caught mine briefly, sharp and assessing, before flicking away as though he hadn't meant to hold my gaze so long. Against my better judgment, I climbed inside. The warmth of the car hit me like a wall, chasing away some of the chill clinging to my skin. He introduced himself as Daniel, his tone casual but tinged with something deeper, something I couldn't quite place yet. As we drove, he asked simple questions: where I worked, what brought me out in this weather. But there was an intensity behind his words, as if he were piecing together fragments of a puzzle rather than making idle conversation. I found myself studying him when he wasn't looking. His hands gripped the steering wheel with quiet confidence, calloused fingers tapping lightly against the leather. His jawline was strong, dusted with stubble that gave him a rugged edge, and his dark hair curled slightly at the ends where it brushed against his collar. There was nothing overtly extraordinary about him, nothing flashy or exaggerated, but there was an undeniable pull, a gravity that drew me, and even as I tried to resist it. When he asked where I lived, I realized I hadn't given him an address yet. The thought of going straight home felt unbearable suddenly. The idea of sitting alone in my dimly lit apartment while the storm raged outside filling me with a dull dread. Before I could second-guess myself, I blurted out, "Actually, do you mind dropping me off near the coffee shop downtown? I need to pick up something." Daniel raised an eyebrow, but didn't question it. "Sure thing," he said, turning the car smoothly onto a side street. The lie hung between us, fragile and unspoken, but neither of us acknowledged it. Maybe he sensed I needed space, or maybe he simply didn't care enough to pry. Either way, I appreciated the silence, to be by the time we reached the coffee shop. The rain had eased into a gentle patter, though puddles still shimmered under the glow of the streetlights. Daniel parked the car and turned to face me fully for the first time since we'd started talking. "Listen," he began, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "If you don't mind, I live nearby. You're soaked to the bone, and I've got towels and a change of clothes if you want to dry off before heading wherever you're going." His offer caught me off guard. Part of me wanted to refuse, to cling stubbornly to the illusion of independence I'd built up over the years. But another part, the part that craved connection, however fleeting, nodded slowly. "Okay," I heard myself say, the words slipping out before I could think better of it. "Thanks." His apartment was small but cozy, tucked above a bakery whose scent lingered faintly in the air. He handed me a towel and disappeared into another room, returning moments later with a pair of sweatpants and a hoodie. While I dried off, he busied himself in the kitchen, the clink of dishes and soft hum of music drifting through the space. It should have felt awkward, intrusive even, being here with someone I barely knew. But instead, it felt safe, like stepping into a cocoon, insulated from the world outside. When I emerged from the bathroom, dressed in his borrowed clothes, he was leaning against the counter with two steaming mugs in hand. "Tea," he offered, holding one out to me. Our fingers brushed as I took it, sending a jolt of electricity coursing through me. I muttered a quick thanks and retreated to the couch, clutching the mug tightly as though it might anchor me till we talked for hours. Or maybe it only felt that way. Time blurred as he shared stories about his childhood, his travels, the dreams he'd chased and abandoned along the way. In return, I opened up about things I rarely spoke of: the pressure of living up to expectations, the ache of feeling like I never quite fit anywhere. With each passing minute, the walls I'd built around myself began to crumble, brick by fragile brick. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, he leaned in closer, his gaze locking onto mine. "You know," he murmured, his voice low and deliberate, "you're different from anyone I've ever met." His hand grazed mine, tentative but sure. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. The tea had grown cold in my hands, but I barely noticed. My focus was entirely on Daniel, who sat across from me on the opposite end of the couch. His posture was relaxed, one arm draped casually over the backrest, yet there was an intensity in his gaze that made it impossible to look away. He wasn't just listening, he was seeing me, really seeing me, in a way no one else ever had. It was unnerving and exhilarating all at once. "You don't talk about yourself much, do you?" he said after a pause, tilting his head slightly, as though trying to read something written between the lines of my expression. I shrugged, feigning nonchalance even as my heart thudded unevenly in my chest. "Not much to say, I guess." He chuckled softly, the sound low and warm, like the first rays of sunlight breaking through a storm cloud. "That's not true, and we both know it. You're holding back. Why?" His question hung in the air, sharp and unrelenting. For a moment, I considered deflecting with humor or brushing him off entirely, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the sincerity in his voice, the way his eyes never wavered from mine. Or maybe it was the fact that for the first time in what felt like forever, someone actually cared enough to ask and seemed genuinely interested in the answer. "I'm not used to people sticking around long enough to care," I admitted finally, the words spilling out before I could second-guess them. "Most people take one look at me and decide they've got me figured out. They don't want to dig deeper than surface-level stuff." Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The movement brought him closer, close enough that I could see the faint flecks of gold in his dark irises. "Well, I'm not most people," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And if you let me, I'd like to stick around longer than tonight." His words sent a shiver down my spine, though whether it was from excitement or fear, I couldn't tell. Part of me wanted to believe him, to trust that this stranger, this man who had taken me in out of the rain, was sincere. But another part, louder and more insistent, whispered warnings in my ear. What did he want from me? Was this some kind of game? And even if it wasn't, how could I possibly allow myself to get attached when attachment always ended in disappointment? Before I could respond, he stood abruptly and crossed the room to retrieve his phone from the kitchen counter. "Here," he said, holding it out to me. "Put your number in. Just in case." "Just in case of what?" I asked, raising an eyebrow despite the flutter of anticipation building in my stomach. "In case you need someone to call next time you're stranded in the rain," he replied with a smirk, though there was a softness in his eyes that suggested he meant more than he was saying. Reluctantly, I took the phone from him and entered my number, my fingers trembling slightly as I typed. When I handed it back, our hands brushed again, and this time neither of us pulled away immediately. His skin was warm against mine, grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed until that moment. The days that followed were a blur of texts and late-night conversations. At first, they were casual, checking in on each other, sharing snippets of our daily lives, but soon they deepened into something more meaningful. We talked about everything: our hopes, our fears, the things we'd never dared to admit aloud. With every message, every phone call, I found myself drawn further into his orbit, unable to resist the gravitational pull he exerted on my heart. But as much as I enjoyed talking to him, meeting up in person proved more complicated. Every time we made plans, something would come up: a work emergency, a family obligation, an inconvenient bout of self-doubt that left me canceling last minute. Each cancellation weighed heavily on me, guilt gnawing at the edges of my conscience, but I couldn't bring myself to follow through. The thought of seeing him again, of facing the undeniable chemistry between us, terrified me. That it wasn't until nearly 2 weeks later that we finally met again. This time, it was intentional, or at least as intentional as anything involving us seemed to be. He invited me to join him for coffee at a small cafe downtown, insisting it was nothing fancy, just a chance to catch up in person. Despite my reservations, I agreed, telling myself it was harmless. After all, what was the worst that could happen? When I arrived, he was already seated at a corner table, nursing a cup of black coffee and scrolling through his phone. He looked up as I approached, a slow smile spreading across his face that made my breath hitch involuntarily. "Hey," he greeted me, standing to pull out the chair across from him. "Glad you made it." "Yeah, well," I trailed off, suddenly acutely aware of how nervous I felt. Up close, he was even more magnetic than I remembered, his presence filling the space around us like a tangible force. I fumbled with the strap of my bag, searching for something, anything, to say. "Thanks for inviting me." "No problem." He gestured toward the barista counter. "Get whatever you want. My treat." I hesitated, torn between accepting his offer and insisting on paying for myself. In the end, I relented, ordering a latte and returning to the table with shaking hands. As I settled into my seat, I noticed the way his eyes lingered on me, studying me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "So," he began, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms loosely over his chest. "Tell me something real, something you haven't told anyone else." The request caught me off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. That was Daniel's way. He had a knack for asking the kinds of questions that forced you to confront parts of yourself you'd rather keep hidden. Still, I hesitated, unsure of where to begin. "I don't know," I hedged, stirring my latte absently. "What do you mean by real?" He tilted his head, considering the question. "Something that scares you. Something you're afraid to admit, even to yourself." His words struck a nerve, hitting too close to home for comfort. How could I explain the tangled web of emotions inside me? The longing I felt whenever I thought of him, the fear that admitting those feelings would only lead to rejection or worse, indifference? How could I put into words the battle raging within me, the constant push and pull between desire and self-preservation? Instead of answering, I deflected with a laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears. "You don't waste any time, do you?" He smiled, but there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes that I couldn't ignore. "No, I don't. Life's too short to waste on small talk." His honesty disarmed me, stripping away the layers of pretense I'd built up over the years. Slowly, haltingly, I began to speak, not about the big things, not yet, but about the little ones. About the nights I spent lying awake, wondering if I'd ever feel truly seen or understood. About the pressure I put on myself to be perfect, to meet expectations I wasn't even sure I believed in anymore. And about the loneliness that clung to me like a second skin. No matter how many people surrounded me, as I spoke, I watched his expression shift, from curiosity to empathy, from understanding to something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. By the time I finished, my throat was raw, my hands trembling around the now empty coffee cup. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then, without warning, he reached across the table and took my hand in his. "You're not alone," he said quietly, his voice steady and sure. "Not anymore." His touch sent a jolt of electricity coursing through me, grounding me in a way I hadn't known I needed. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away, unwilling to let him see how deeply his words affected me. Instead, I nodded, squeezing his hand briefly before pulling away. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. "For listening." "Always," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "Whenever you're ready to talk, I'll be here." That night, As I lay in bed replaying the conversation in my mind, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. I was falling for him. Not because of anything grand or dramatic, but because of the quiet moments, the way he listened without judgment, the way he saw me for who I truly was beneath all the walls I'd built. Falling for him felt inevitable, like gravity pulling me towards something I couldn't escape even if I tried. But with that realization came a fresh wave of fear. What if he didn't feel the same way? What if I opened myself up completely, only to have him walk away? And even if he did reciprocate my feelings, what then? Could I handle the vulnerability, the uncertainty, the risk of letting someone else hold such power over my heart? For now, I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the warmth of his hand in mine, the promise in his eyes when he said he'd be there. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. Daniel had changed something inside me, awakened a part of myself I'd long since buried. Whether that change would lead to joy or heartbreak remained to be seen. The next few weeks unfolded like the turning of pages in a story I hadn't realized I was writing. Each meeting with Daniel felt like another chapter, layered with moments that were equal parts tender and terrifying. Our connection deepened not through grand gestures, but through small, deliberate acts, the kind that slipped past defenses before you even knew they'd breached the walls that IT started with coffee dates, which quickly became a ritual. Every Thursday evening, we met at the same cafe downtown, claiming our usual corner table by the window. The baristas began to recognize us, greeting us with knowing smiles, as though they could sense the unspoken current running between us. Over steaming cups of espresso and mismatched pastries, we talked about everything and nothing. Books we loved, movies that made us cry, childhood memories we hadn't revisited in years. His laughter was infectious, rich and resonant, filling the space around us like sunlight breaking through clouds. It was impossible not to smile when he did point one rainy afternoon. Fittingly reminiscent of the night we first met, he suggested we skip the cafe altogether and head to his apartment instead. "I've got wine," he said with a mischievous grin, holding up a bottle he'd picked up on the way, "and a playlist guaranteed to make even the gloomiest day feel cozy." I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. By then, saying yes to him had become easier, though no less nerve-wracking. As we walked side by side under the shelter of his umbrella, I caught myself stealing glances at him, marveling at how effortlessly he seemed to navigate the world. There was an ease about him, a quiet confidence that drew people in without demanding attention. Even now, soaked sneakers squeaking against wet pavement, he exuded a warmth that made me want to stay close. Back at his place, he lit candles scattered across the living room, their flickering glow casting soft shadows on the walls. The scent of vanilla mingled with the faint aroma of rain seeping through the cracked window, creating an atmosphere so intimate it almost felt surreal. He handed me a glass of red wine, his fingers brushing mine as he passed it over. The touch lingered longer than necessary, sending a shiver down my spine. "Cheers," he said, raising his glass. "To rainy days and good company." "To both," I echoed, clinking my glass against his. The wine was smooth and slightly sweet, warming me from the inside out. We settled onto the couch, legs stretched out and shoulders nearly touching. For a while, neither of us spoke, content to listen to the music playing softly in the background, a mix of jazz and indie folk that somehow matched the mood perfectly. Eventually, he turned to face me, his expression thoughtful. "You ever think about what makes someone unforgettable?" he asked, his voice low and contemplative that I blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Unforgettable?" "Yeah." He swirled the wine in his glass, watching the liquid catch the candlelight. "Like, there are people who come into your life and leave an imprint. They change something in you, whether you realize it right away or not. And then there are others, well, they're just passing through." His words stirred something deep within me, stirring up memories of faces and voices I tried to forget. "I guess I've never thought about it like that," I admitted. "But yeah, I know what you mean. Some people stick, no matter how hard you try to let them go." He nodded slowly, his gaze locking onto mine. "Exactly. And sometimes, those people show up when you least expect it, when you're not ready for them." The implication hung heavy in the air, unspoken, yet undeniable. My pulse quickened, my mind racing to decipher the subtext behind his words. Was he talking about me? About us? Before I could ask, or maybe before I lost my nerve, he leaned in closer, his hand finding mine where it rested on the couch cushion. "You're one of those people," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whether you realize it or not." My breath hitched, the weight of his confession pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to pull away, to retreat back into the safety of distance and denial. But another part, the part that craved connection, that yearned to be seen and understood, held steady. Instead of pulling back, I tightened my grip on his hand, letting the warmth of his skin anchor me. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," I confessed, my voice trembling. "For whatever this is, I'm scared of messing it up." He smiled gently, his thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just trust me. Trust us." Trust wasn't easy for me. Years of building walls around my heart had conditioned me to keep people at arm's length, to guard myself against the inevitable pain of rejection or loss. But with Daniel, those walls began to crumble, brick by fragile brick. It wasn't just his words. It was the way he showed up, consistently and without expectation. He didn't push me to move faster than I was comfortable with. Instead, he gave me space to breathe, to process, to stumble, and find my footing again. Our bond grew stronger with each shared experience. One Saturday morning, he surprised me with tickets to an art exhibit downtown. "I figured you could use a break from routine," he said with a wink as we stood in line outside the gallery. "Besides, I hear the sculptures are supposed to be amazing." The exhibit was breathtaking, each piece more intricate and evocative than the last. We wandered through the halls together, pausing occasionally to admire a particularly striking work. At one point, we found ourselves standing before a massive installation, a tangle of metal wires shaped into the form of two figures reaching toward each other. The plaque beside it read "Connection," and something about it struck a chord deep within me. "This feels familiar," I joked, nudging him playfully. "Two people trying to bridge the gap between them." He laughed, the sound warm and melodic. "Maybe we should take a picture. For posterity." We posed in front of the sculpture, arms slung casually around each other's shoulders. As the flash went off, I couldn't help but notice the way his eyes softened when he looked at me, as though I were the most important thing in the room. It was a look I'd come to cherish, one that made my chest ache in the best possible way. Afterward, we grabbed lunch at a nearby diner, splitting a plate of greasy fries and swapping stories about our favorite pieces from the exhibit. He told me about a painting he'd been drawn to, a vibrant abstract piece bursting with color, and how it reminded him of the chaos and beauty of falling in love. "Love isn't always neat or predictable," he said, dipping a fry into ketchup. "Sometimes it's messy and overwhelming, but that's what makes it worth it." His words stayed with me long after we left the diner, echoing in my mind as I replayed the day's events. Falling in love. The phrase sent a thrill coursing through me, followed immediately by a wave of panic. Was that what this was? Could I even call it that yet? The uncertainty gnawed at me, keeping me awake late into the night as I stared at the ceiling, replaying every interaction, every glance, every touch. Despite my fears, there were moments of pure joy that reminded me why I kept coming back to him. Like the time we spent an entire afternoon baking cookies in his tiny kitchen, flour dusting our clothes and hair as we argued good-naturedly over whose recipe was better. Or the impromptu dance party that erupted when we discovered a mutual love for 80s pop hits, spinning each other around the living room until we collapsed in fits of laughter. Those lighter moments balanced the emotional intensity of our relationship, grounding us in reality even as we ventured further into uncharted territory. They reminded me that love, or whatever this was, didn't have to be serious all the time. It could be fun, spontaneous, imperfect, and maybe, just maybe, that was okay. That'd be why the time autumn rolled around, our connection had grown into something undeniable. Walking beside him through parks painted gold with fallen leaves, sharing quiet moments on park benches as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a sense of belonging I hadn't known I was missing. Yet even as my feelings for him deepened, so too did the fear of losing him. What if I wasn't enough? What if I ruined everything by wanting too much? One crisp October evening, as we sat together on his balcony watching the stars emerge one by one, he turned to me with a look of quiet determination. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. That my heart clenched, bracing for impact. "Okay, I'm falling for you," he admitted, his words simple yet devastating in their honesty. "And I don't want to scare you off, but I also can't keep pretending this is just friendship. Not anymore." Tears welled in my eyes, blurring the constellations above us. In that moment, I realized I'd been waiting for him to say those words. Not because I needed permission to feel, but because hearing them aloud made everything real. Made us real. "I'm falling for you too," I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of emotion. I am scared." He reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "So am I. But we'll figure it out together." And for the first time in a long time, I believed him. The air between us had shifted, charged with an electricity that neither of us could ignore. It was as though every word we'd exchanged, every glance and touch, had been leading to this moment. A precipice we were both teetering on, unsure whether to leap or retreat. It happened on a Friday night, one of those rare evenings where the world outside seemed to fade away entirely. Daniel had invited me over after work, citing a need for company, but implying something deeper in the way he texted. Casual yet deliberate, his words carrying a weight I couldn't quite place. When I arrived, he greeted me at the door with a sheepish smile, holding up 2 takeout bags from my favorite Thai restaurant. "I figured you'd need sustenance before whatever comes next," he said, his tone light, but tinged with nervousness that we ate together at his kitchen counter, laughing over shared memories and debating which dish was better, the pad thai or the green curry. For a while, it felt like any other evening we'd spent together. Easy, comfortable, familiar. But beneath the surface, there was a tension simmering, a quiet undercurrent pulling us closer with each passing second. I could see it in the way his eyes lingered on mine just a fraction longer than usual, hear it in the slight hitch of his voice when he asked how my day had gone. After dinner, we moved to the couch, settling into our usual spots. He turned on some music, soft piano melodies that filled the room with a dreamlike haze, and leaned back against the cushions, watching me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "You okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly as though he sensed something was off. "I'm fine," I replied, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. My hands fidgeted restlessly in my lap, twisting the hem of my sweater until it bunched awkwardly around my fingers. "Just thinking." "About what?" His question caught me off guard, forcing me to confront the thoughts I'd been trying so hard to suppress. About how much I wanted him, about how terrified I was of letting myself want him, about the way my heart raced every time he looked at me, like he could see straight through all my carefully constructed defenses. Instead of answering, I shook my head, attempting a weak laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Nothing important." He didn't press further. Not immediately, anyway. Instead, he reached out and placed a hand on my knee, his touch grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. "You don't have to pretend with me, you know," he said softly, his gaze unwavering. "Whatever's going on in that head of yours, you can tell me. I'm not going anywhere." His words broke something inside me, releasing a flood of emotions I'd been holding back for weeks. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and unexpected, and I blinked rapidly to keep them at bay. "It's not that simple," I murmured, my voice barely audible over the music. "What if I screw this up? What if I let myself feel too much and then lose you?" His expression softened, a mixture of understanding and resolve. "And what if you don't?" he countered gently. "What if letting yourself feel is exactly what you need? What if loving someone doesn't mean losing them? It means finding a piece of yourself you didn't know was missing." His response hit me like a tidal wave, sweeping away the last vestiges of resistance I'd clung to. I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation or doubt, but found none. Only certainty. Only trust. Slowly, hesitantly, I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Okay, I whispered, the word trembling as it left my lips. Okay. Before I could second-guess myself, he leaned in, closing the distance between us with a tenderness that took my breath away. His lips brushed against mine tentatively at first, testing the waters, before deepening into something more urgent, more real. The kiss was everything I'd imagined and nothing like I'd prepared for. A collision of passion and vulnerability that left me dizzy and disoriented. My hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping tightly as though afraid he might disappear if I let go. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathing heavily, he rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed as though savoring the moment. That was, he began, trailing off with a shaky laugh. Wow. Yeah, I agreed, my voice hoarse but filled with awe. Wow. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, content to simply exist in the aftermath of what had just transpired. But as the initial shock wore off, reality began to creep back in, bringing with it a fresh wave of uncertainty. What does this mean? I asked quietly, voicing the question that had been lingering in the back of my mind since the kiss ended. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair as he sat back against the couch. It means we stop pretending, he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for ambiguity. It means we stop being scared of what might happen and start focusing on what is happening. Right here, right now. His conviction gave me strength, bolstering my resolve to embrace whatever came next. Still, doubts lingered at the edges of my mind, whispering warnings I couldn't entirely silence. What if people don't understand? I ventured cautiously, voicing one of my biggest fears. What if they judge us, or worse, try to tear us apart? He reached for my hand again, intertwining our fingers as though to remind me I wasn't alone. Then we deal with it together, he said simply. Because at the end of the day, the only opinions that matter are ours, not theirs. His reassurance was exactly what I needed to hear, even if it didn't erase all my anxieties overnight. Love, I realized, wasn't about eliminating fear. It was about choosing to move forward despite it. And in that moment, sitting beside Daniel with his hand in mine, I knew I was ready to take that step. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and heightened awareness. Every touch, every glance, carried new meaning now that the boundaries between us had shifted. We navigated this new dynamic with equal parts excitement and caution, learning each other in ways we hadn't allowed ourselves to before. There were still challenges ahead, moments of insecurity, conversations about the future. But for the first time, I felt hopeful rather than overwhelmed. One evening, as we lay side by side on his bed, staring up at the ceiling while soft music played in the background, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever think about forever? He asked, his voice low and contemplative that I hesitated, considering the question. Forever was such a daunting concept, especially when applied to something as fragile and unpredictable as love. But looking at him now, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing sync with mine, I realized it wasn't as far-fetched as it once seemed. Maybe, I admitted, smiling faintly. But for now, I'll settle for today. He grinned, leaning over to press a kiss to my temple. Today's a good start. And it was. Whatever tomorrow held, we would face it together. The days that followed our first kiss were a kaleidoscope of emotions. Joy, fear, exhilaration, and uncertainty all swirling together in a dizzying mix. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen, truly wanted. But with that newfound connection came a cascade of questions I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. What did this mean for us? How would the world react? And most importantly, could I handle the weight of loving someone so deeply without losing myself in the process? At first, it seemed like nothing had changed. We fell into a rhythm, spending our evenings together just as we always had, cooking dinner, watching movies, or simply sitting side by side in comfortable silence. Yet everything had changed. Every touch carried an electric charge. Every glance spoke volumes. The air between us buzzed with unspoken promises and lingering vulnerabilities. It was intoxicating, but also terrifying. Why fears weren't unfounded. Within a week, whispers began to circulate at work. Someone must have spotted us leaving Daniel's apartment one morning, his hand brushing mine as we said goodbye. By lunchtime, the gossip mill was in full swing. "Did you hear about Alex?" A coworker whispered loudly enough for me to overhear. "Apparently, he's seeing someone. A guy." I froze mid-bite, my sandwich suddenly tasting like ash in my mouth. My stomach churned as I debated whether to confront them or pretend I hadn't heard. In the end, I chose the latter, retreating to the safety of my office and closing the door behind me. Coworkers' opinions shouldn't have mattered. They barely knew me, but their judgment stung more than I cared to admit. Each hushed comment felt like a brick being added to the wall I'd worked so hard to dismantle. When Daniel called later that evening, I hesitated before answering. Part of me wanted to confide in him, to share the weight pressing down on my chest. But another part, the stubborn, self-protective part, insisted on handling it alone. "Hey," I said when I finally picked up, forcing a lightness into my tone that didn't quite reach my voice. "What's up?" "You tell me," he replied, his concern evident even over the phone. "You sound off. Everything okay?" I sighed, leaning back against the couch and staring at the ceiling. "It's stupid," I muttered, rubbing my temples. "Just some stuff at work. Nothing serious." "Doesn't sound stupid to me," he countered gently. "Talk to me." For a moment, I considered brushing him off again, telling him it wasn't worth worrying about. But then I remembered his words from the night of our first kiss. "We deal with it together." Slowly, haltingly, I recounted the day's events. The whispers, the sideways glances, the suffocating sense of being judged. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice steady but tinged with anger. "No one should have to go through that." "It's fine," I insisted, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. "I'll get over it." "No, it's not fine," he shot back, his frustration palpable. "This isn't something you just get over. It's shitty and unfair, and it pisses me off that people feel entitled to comment on your life." His defense warmed me. Even his tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. "Thanks," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. "But what am I supposed to do? Tell everyone to mind their own business?" "If that's what it takes," he replied without hesitation. "Look, I know it's scary putting yourself out there. Trust me, I've been there. But hiding who you are because you're afraid of what others might think, that's no way to live." His words struck a nerve, hitting too close to home for comfort. He was right. I couldn't keep running from this, couldn't keep letting fear dictate my choices. But knowing that and acting on it were two very different things. The tension at work only escalated over the next few days. A particularly pointed comment from my boss during a meeting left me reeling, questioning whether staying in this environment was worth the toll it was taking on my mental health. "We need to maintain professionalism here," she said, her gaze flicking pointedly in my direction. The implication was clear, even if the words themselves were vague. That night, I showed up at Daniel's apartment unannounced, my hands trembling as I knocked on the door. He opened it almost immediately, his expression shifting from surprise to concern when he saw the look on my face. "Come in," he said softly, stepping aside to let me pass. Once inside, I collapsed onto the couch, burying my head in my hands. "I can't do this anymore," I confessed, my voice breaking under the weight of emotion. "I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. I feel like I'm drowning." He sat down beside me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders and pulling me close. "You're not alone in this," he reminded me, his voice firm yet gentle. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." His reassurance helped, but it didn't erase the reality of the situation. Over the next several weeks, I wrestled with the decision to either stay at my job and endure the toxic environment or leave and risk financial instability. Daniel encouraged me to prioritize my well-being, offering practical advice and emotional support whenever I needed it. Still, the choice weighed heavily on me, a constant reminder of the sacrifices required to live authentically. Amidst the chaos, there were moments of lightness that kept me grounded. One weekend, Daniel surprised me with tickets to a local comedy show, insisting I needed a break from the stress. As we laughed until our sides hurt, surrounded by strangers who shared none of our struggles, I felt a fleeting sense of normalcy, a reminder that joy could coexist with pain. But the external challenges weren't the only ones I faced. Internally, I grappled with insecurities I hadn't fully confronted before. Was I enough for Daniel? Could I give him the kind of relationship he deserved? One built on trust and mutual respect rather than fear and self-doubt. These questions haunted me, resurfacing in quiet moments when I least expected them. One evening, as we lay tangled together in bed, I voiced my fears aloud. What if I mess this up? I asked, my voice barely audible in the dim light. What if I'm not good enough for you? Daniel propped himself up on one elbow, studying me with an intensity that made my heart race. You're already more than enough, he said firmly, his fingers tracing patterns along my arm. But relationships aren't about perfection. They're about growth, about learning how to be better together. His response eased some of the anxiety gnawing at me, but it didn't eliminate it entirely. Love, I realized, wasn't a destination. It was a journey, messy and unpredictable. And while I still had doubts, I also had hope. Hope that we could navigate the challenges ahead, that we could build something strong enough to withstand whatever came our way. That as autumn gave way to winter, the frosty air outside mirrored the chill that lingered in certain corners of my life. Work remained tense, though I'd begun exploring new opportunities that aligned more closely with my values. My family, too, proved a source of friction when they discovered my relationship with Daniel. Their reactions ranged from disapproval to outright hostility, leaving me torn between loyalty to them and fidelity to myself. Through it all, Daniel remained steadfast, a beacon of stability in an otherwise turbulent sea. Together, we faced each obstacle head-on, supporting each other through the highs and lows. There were still unanswered questions, still uncertainties about what the future held. But for now, that was enough. Because in the quiet moments, in the warmth of his embrace, the steadiness of his gaze, I found a peace I hadn't known was possible. And maybe, just maybe, that was all that mattered. Winter settled over the city like a quiet, unyielding blanket, its frosty grip softening the edges of everything it touched. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, but inside Daniel's apartment, our shared sanctuary, the air remained warm and inviting. It wasn't just the radiator humming softly in the corner or the candles flickering on the windowsill. It was us, together. We had created something that felt sturdy enough to weather even the harshest storms. That be why now I'd made my decision about work. After weeks of soul-searching and countless conversations with Daniel, I handed in my resignation letter, choosing instead to pursue freelance opportunities that allowed me more freedom and less toxicity. It wasn't an easy choice. Financial uncertainty loomed large, and the thought of stepping away from the stability I'd clung to for so long scared me. But as Daniel reminded me one evening while we sat side by side drafting cover letters, sometimes you have to burn down what isn't working to make room for something better. His words stayed with me, echoing in my mind whenever doubt crept in, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to see the truth in them. Letting go of the old didn't mean erasing it entirely. It meant honoring the lessons it taught me while making space for growth. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building a life not out of obligation or fear, but out of intention. My family, however, proved harder to reconcile. Their initial reaction to my relationship with Daniel had been sharp and cutting, their disapproval slicing through me like shards of glass. They questioned my choices, my priorities, my very identity, as though loving him somehow diminished who I was. For weeks, I avoided their calls, too hurt and angry to engage. But eventually, I realized avoidance wouldn't solve anything. If I wanted closure, if I wanted peace, I needed to face them head on. The conversation was tense, fraught with moments where I thought I might crumble under the weight of their expectations. My mother cried, her voice trembling as she pleaded with me to think about what this means for your future. My father remained stoic, his silence speaking volumes. But amidst the pain and frustration, there were glimpses of understanding, small cracks in the wall they'd built around themselves. When I finally said, "I love him, and nothing you say will change that," my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face, something shifted. Not acceptance, exactly, but acknowledgement. a tentative step toward bridging the gap between us. Daniel listened quietly when I recounted the call later that night, his hand resting lightly on my knee as I spoke. When I finished, he pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as though trying to shield me from the lingering ache. "You did good," he murmured against my hair. "That couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," I admitted, leaning into him. "But it felt necessary, like I owed it to myself to stand up for what I believe in." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And maybe someday they'll come around. Or maybe they won't. Either way, you've got me. Always." His promise filled me with a warmth that chased away the chill left behind by the conversation. No matter what happened with my family or anyone else, we had each other. That knowledge alone was enough to keep me grounded. That as the weeks turned into months, I noticed subtle changes in myself. The constant anxiety that used to gnaw at me had begun to loosen its hold, replaced by a quiet confidence I hadn't known I was capable of. I started saying yes to things I would have once dismissed as impossible, taking on projects that challenged me creatively, attending social events without overthinking every interaction, even reconnecting with old friends I'd drifted away from. Each small victory felt monumental, a testament to how far I'd come since that rainy night when Daniel first offered me a ride home. One evening, as we walked hand in hand through a park dusted with fresh snow, I paused beneath a lamppost and turned to face him. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, his breath visible in soft puffs as he smiled down at me. "What is it?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I wanted to thank you. For everything. For being patient with me. For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. I don't know if I'd be here, like this, without you." His smile softened, his eyes shining with emotion. "You give me too much credit," he teased gently. "You're the one who did all the hard work. I just held your hand along the way." "Maybe," I conceded, squeezing his fingers. "But you made it easier. You made me feel like I could handle whatever came next." We stood there for a moment, the world around us hushed and still, before he leaned in and kissed me. A slow, tender press of lips that carried the weight of everything unsaid between us. When he pulled back, his gaze locked onto mine, full of a quiet certainty that made my chest ache in the best possible way. "We'll keep handling it together," he promised. "Whatever comes next." In the end, our story wasn't perfect. There were still challenges ahead, moments of doubt, disagreements, external pressures we couldn't fully escape. But perfection wasn't the goal. What mattered was the connection we'd built, brick by fragile brick, weathering the storms and celebrating the sunshine. Love, I realized, wasn't about finding someone who completed you. It was about finding someone who encouraged you to become the fullest version of yourself. As we continued walking through the park, our footsteps crunching softly in the snow, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the bumps. Because no matter what happened, I knew two things for certain. I was enough, and I wasn't alone. And sometimes, that was all the hope you needed to keep moving forward.